Yes.
Live. Good morning. So, welcome to this question and answer session for this week of the course. So, please feel free to send in your questions so that I can respond to them. Welcome to this question and answer session. And I've got a couple of questions here to start off with. So, I'll start with one which basically talks about the focus of the course. So it's basically saying that the focus of the course seems to favour productivity increase in monocropping and large-scale farming. And yet we learnt last week that a diverse diet is really very good for human nutrition and health. So how do we achieve productivity growth to produce more food and at the same time more diverse food that's accessible and affordable for all? So really, what's the focus of the course? Well, I guess many of the examples that we used in the beginning of the course did talk about larger scale farming, although we had some session looking at smallholder farming as well. And with this idea of a diverse diet, for myself, I work very much in smallholder systems, particularly in Africa. And of course, one of the things we're faced with often is that people are producing one or two crops as staple crops, as crops from the market. And we need then, in those systems, to have diversification. And I think very often diversification and productivity increase can go hand in hand. A really good example for us is the idea of getting away from monocropping of staple crops like maize or cassava, and the integration of legumes, for instance. So legumes have all of the benefits of helping to improve soil fertility, of capturing nitrogen from the air, but also being much more nutritious in terms of minerals and vitamins, as well as the protein that you're getting directly from the air. So I don't think that necessarily that we shouldn't be thinking again in dichotomies here. It's not necessarily that productivity increase needs necessarily to lead to a decrease in diversity in the system. And there are many real advantages from diversifying crop production systems in terms of soil fertility, as we just mentioned, but also in terms of suppressing pests and diseases, which go hand in hand then with having a more diverse diet. So I think that those two basically can really work well together. Another question that I've got lined up here is one thinking about the use of organic fertilizers versus the use of mineral fertilizers. And in the lectures, I put a lot of emphasis on the need to use both together. The question is then, when we think about sustainable agriculture, isn't it always best to use only organic if possible? There are reasons for this. And the question is saying, well, we produce a lot of greenhouse gases in the production of mineral fertilizer. And then that basically that they're expensive for farmers. So again, I don't think it's a matter of either or. For me, it's very much a matter of and. And when we think about organic systems, we tend to always think that organic systems are better for the environment. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. To give you one example would be that although you rely on the nutrient cycle, on the biology, at the same time we're often producing less because organic systems are often limited in terms of the amounts of nutrients that are provided for crop growth. If that means then that we have to use, we're producing lower yields, then potentially we're having to use more land to produce the same amount of food. So when we actually do the calculations for what the greenhouse gas emissions are, rather than thinking per area of land, but we're thinking per kilo of food produced, then we often find that if synthetic fertilizers are used efficiently, that actually the overall greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of food produced can be less than under organic systems. The other big importance of using organic fertilizers is to maintain the soil in a healthy state. So soil organic carbon is often thought of and used as a good indicator of sustainability because the organic matter status of soils is a good indicator of what the soil health is, if you like. And usually when we can maintain a good soil organic matter, we can also at the same time maintain an efficient use of fertilizers. So very much they go, in my mind, hand in hand, and we really need to use all of the resources that are available more efficiently. And next question I want to move to is whether I can give examples of agricultural systems that are both adapted for climate change and at the same time mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is a good one, because obviously to adapt to climate change, actually one of the best ways we find of doing that is to make sure that we're using essentially good agricultural practices and therefore producing a good yield per hectare. The systems really that are good at mitigating greenhouse gas emissions are those that can lock up more carbon at the same time. And in particular, agroforestry systems can be very good in this regard. That's because to lock up carbon, to keep a good carbon store in the system, we can maintain more, to be honest, above ground rather than in the soil. So soil organic matter is important, but if we look at the total carbon stocks of systems, then very much looking at the carbon stock above ground is very important. So to give you a couple of examples, if we think about production of crops like coffee or cocoa, they often grow very well under shade. If we can use shade trees, the shade trees lock up carbon, so they provide a carbon stock. And at the same time, they shade the crop, and both coffee and cocoa crops which evolved under shade, so they grow well under a moderate amount of shade. And at the same time, the shade trees can actually mitigate temperature, so they can keep temperatures down, often 1 or 2 degrees or even more lower temperatures than you find in the open sun. So at the same time as you're mitigating the effect of temperature rise through mitigating, keeping the temperature down for crop growth, you can also then be locking up carbon in the biomass above ground. Now, obviously, agroforestry systems don't work everywhere, and they need to be tailored to local conditions. We've had another good example recently of work we've been doing together with researchers in Ethiopia with this tree, Phyderbia albida. So that's a tree which is a legume, it's a nitrogen fixer. But it's one which is often maintained in the fields of cereals. So the tree itself is a carbon store. It creates islands of soil fertility underneath it, where basically the nitrogen fixation and recycling of nutrients from the falling leaves actually creates fertile soil under the tree, where the crop then tends to grow better. And at the same time, by providing moderate shade, we can actually moderate temperatures as well. And we've got some nice examples there in Ethiopia where yields of wheat are actually larger under the tree because the moderation of temperature gives us then a slower crop development. The crop's got longer to develop and grow, and therefore that leads overall to higher yields. The question goes on to ask whether it's possible to convert all of the world's agriculture to systems that both adapt and mitigate climate change. And I think we have to be a bit more careful there. I think it's very clear that we can adapt to climate change. And generally, adaptation to climate change means the use of more of better management practices. So making sure that we're using resources efficiently, we're getting good yields. That is usually a good way also of adapting to climate variability and climate unpredictability. That all agriculture can contribute to mitigation, I think, is maybe a large call, because obviously we can do our best to reduce unnecessary losses and gaseous losses, which would contribute to global warming by more efficient use of fertilizers and reduction of gaseous losses of nitrogen. But to mitigate in terms of building up carbon stocks under continuous cropping is actually quite a challenging thing to achieve. Okay, so another question. The question reads, I think in my situation, and this is somebody calling from Zimbabwe, the yields are very low in my country, and farmers, it would be good if farmers use more fertilizer. So this is going against a bit the idea that we can simply rely on organic manures. But then fertilizers are really expensive. So how can we make fertilizers more affordable? And this is probably one of the biggest questions for agriculture in Africa in terms of topical debates. If we go back to a situation say 10 years ago, then really the whole thinking was that fertilizer subsidies were wrong. But there are lots of countries now who are reintroducing fertilizer subsidies. And they're doing that for very good reasons. I mean, in Africa, all fertilizers just about are imported. And because of the transport costs, that makes fertilizers very expensive. And it's hard to actually get fertilizers into the systems without some form of subsidy. Now, those subsidies can be simply subsidies on transport and the like to make sure that the provision of fertilizers is more affordable, or they can be direct subsidies. I mean, one example that's very often used is the example of Malawi, where essentially without fertilizer use, the country really struggles to be food self-sufficient. But so we're in a situation of very often having to provide food relief. And there's a very strong argument, in my view, that it's better to provide farmers with fertilizer so that they'd be then able to produce their own food, rather than providing subsidies in the form of direct food aid. And certainly when it comes to the overall economics of food aid versus fertilizer provision, then there's a very strong case that it's better to put the subsidy on the fertilizer and give people, if you like, the self-respect and the opportunity to build to grow their own food, rather than providing them with food handouts. So another question coming in which relates back to climate change. So how can sub-Saharan Africa, another one from Africa, mainstream in sustainable intensification of agriculture without degrading the already vulnerable system? And I think this reflects back to the discussion we were just having then about climate smart agriculture, if you like, being able to look at systems which can mitigate and adapt to climate change. And to avoid degrading an already vulnerable ecosystem, well, essentially there, for me, that's very, very much linked again to the question of soil fertility, that we need to maintain soil organic matter levels so that soils don't degrade. And it's very often in situations where the soil organic matter levels fall that you actually get poorer infiltration of water during rainfall events, which then leads to erosion. So really, maybe it sounds a bit too simple, but I think there again, simply good agricultural practice comes in very much as being the means to adapt to climate change, and particularly then integrated soil fertility management comes back to the fore. Another question goes on. Yeah, that our module focuses very much on sustainable intensification in the crop sector. But what about livestock? So there's a huge debate about which way to go in terms of animal production. A debate about whether we should be looking at poultry rather than cattle. So that poultry are often seen, and are in fact, very much more feed efficient in terms of the conversion of feed into meat, into protein that can be used by humans. Whereas, and they're much more efficient than cattle. So, and cattle, then basically, how do we manage to feed cattle? And I think this question really goes to the core of the intensification debate in particularly the smallholder sector. I think here, when we're thinking about livestock systems, we've got to think very much beyond simply the production of meat and milk. Very often, livestock, and particularly cattle, so people are often arguing that we should produce less cattle, that we should be less dependent on cattle because of this food inefficiency. We often see that, that people saying if we feed grain to cattle, then we have an efficiency of use of less than 10%, whereas of course if we feed directly, we can feed many more people. But that's again, it's rather a simplistic argument. Cattle have many, many more uses in agriculture than simply the provision of meat and milk. In many African systems, cattle are an important form of traction. So they're used for soil tillage and for transport as well. So that the draft power of animals is very important. They're also an important source of manure, and because they concentrate the nutrients then from using crop residues and other off-farm resources into manure that can be used then back in the fields, it's an important form of nutrient cycling. Sorry, somebody just opened the door. Lose my thread of thought. So we've got the other uses. We've got draft power. We've got the use of cattle then in terms of manure provision. And very often when we ask farmers what are the important reasons that you keep cattle, that they often mention these two. And the other important use of cattle is, of course, in terms of a buffering against unexpected eventualities like droughts. So cattle can be a form of insurance. They're a form of investment. If farmers have extra money, they often like to invest in buying extra cattle. And then they can use those cattle to buffer them against risk. So if you hit a really bad drought period, you can actually sell cattle, sell a beast, and that can help you to tide over the difficult period. So some studies have been done which try and put a value on each of these different benefits of livestock. So instead of just thinking about the greenhouse gas emissions in relation to milk or meat production, they try and take the economic benefits into account as well in relation to manure production, draft power, and then the insurance value. And when we take all of those different benefits into account, then we can think then actually basically livestock doesn't come out so bad in terms of the environment in relation to greenhouse gas production. Now it's quite clear though that livestock systems can be improved in terms of their efficiency. Usually that means going over from free grazing systems to more like zero grazing systems, where we end up then growing feed. So growing, for instance, in the African highlands, you go into growing napier grass or legumes along the field boundaries or along soil erosion bunds, and then feeding the cattle in stalls in what we call zero grazing systems. And they can then be much more efficient in terms of cycling of the nutrients through the livestock, collecting the manure, and taking that back into the field. So there are efficiencies to be made in terms of livestock feeding, certainly. There are efficiencies to be made also in terms of manure management to make sure that we don't lose the nutrients as they go through the cycle manure production and taking the manure back to the field. The other part of this debate, which is very important, is that there are lots of areas of the world where the soils and the climate really aren't suitable for cropping, where really grass production is one of the best uses of land. And obviously in those situations, then livestock production systems, whether for meat or for milk, are really the only effective economic agricultural use of land. So to simply say we should do away with livestock ignores the fact that much of the land in the world can really only be used for grass production. Another question. It's often said that soil fertility is degrading, and at the same time, we're running out of nutrients. So, for instance, that phosphorus is becoming limiting in terms of its availability. So how can we rebuild soil fertility without depleting resources? So it's probably worth here taking a few minutes to think about this issue of phosphorus. We focus quite a lot in the discussion in the course on nitrogen, because nitrogen is such a mobile nutrient, and it's one which can be lost easily from the system. It's one which has contributions to greenhouse gases. Its leaching losses are important because it's so mobile. And we mentioned in the lecture that phosphorus is very different. It's more of a mineral cycle. But that also means that whereas we've got, if you like, an infinite resource of nitrogen, because the air around us is 80% nitrogen, with phosphorus, we've got a finite resource. We have to use phosphorus from the mineral form. Now that means then that we mine phosphorus in terms of mining rocks, and those resources are then converted either into a more available form of phosphorus in fertilizers, or they're sometimes brought back to the field in terms of as a rock phosphorus, so just a ground up rock. Now those rocks are often, the rock sources of phosphorus are often not available enough to be used directly. So there's only a limited number of phosphate rocks which can really be used directly in agriculture. A couple of years ago, there were some rather alarming papers which appeared, which suggested that the global reserves of phosphorus were really down to something like a maximum of 150 years, that we only had enough phosphorus reserves to actually last in agriculture for 150 years. And this really caused a big focus then on further research on phosphorus. Now, one of the first findings, and very luckily really, was that a re-examination of all of the different sources of phosphorus globally led to a new estimate which suggests that we've got something in the order of 400 years before those phosphorus reserves will run out. Again, you can say, well, 400 years really isn't very long when we think of the lifetime of man and we think about sustainability for the future. So that there's a lot of emphasis these days on looking at opportunities for recapturing phosphorus and bringing it back into the agricultural cycle. The issues in the question are actually saying that we have phosphorus running into the sea. But actually, one of the good things about phosphorus is that it is very immobile in soil, so that when we add phosphorus to the soil, we're actually building up the phosphorus reserves for the future. And what we find is if phosphorus can be used continually over the longer term, within about 10 years or so, you often get to the state in a soil where you've built up the phosphorus reserves to the extent that maintenance fertilization, so simply replacing what's being taken out, is all that's needed. So to start off with, you need more phosphorus to build up the soil fertility. But in time, because that phosphorus remains and some of it becomes available each year for crop production, we can actually go over in the longer term to reducing the inputs of fertilizer, phosphorus, and getting a really very, very efficient use. I think overall, though, we do have to recognise that the long term for phosphorus is a big concern. And it's likely then that we're going to have to find better ways in the long term of using phosphorus more efficiently. And that'll really mean then a much bigger focus on recycling in agriculture in the longer term. Another question here is, how best can information about climate change and climate change resilient agriculture be passed to the smallholder rural farmer? Yeah, good question. One of the big issues with smallholder farming is, of course, we're dealing with many, many farmers with small areas of land. That means then that we have, in terms of extension services and in terms of communication services, we're really trying to reach many, many, many more individuals than we are in an area where, let's say, we have more larger farms and more commercial agriculture, because then basically the farms are large and within a given area, it's much easier, if you like, to reach that farming community. Some of the most exciting examples that I've seen in the past years around this idea of communication relates then to the use of radio in rural settings. We've been working, for instance, in Tanzania with Farm Radio International, who are an international NGO, who actually help to provide material in terms of extension material to different radio programs, which can then be broadcast. And in one of these collaborations, we've actually been working together with a whole range of different research and extension organizations to come up with good crop recommendations. That information has been consolidated into a form that's actually being used through magazines and comics. There's one in East Africa, the Shujaz comics, where we were able to put out extension information related to the production of common beans. And I know that those comics on their own reached over 200,000 people when we did the impact assessment. Now, at the same time, the radio programs that we're broadcasting, they can really reach millions. These are often broadcast at prime time, say on a Sunday evening, and we've also been using them together with extension officers and farmer groups to actually sit around the radio and work together then in a group in terms of assimilating the information and using that as a basis for discussion. So I do think we've got to be very innovative in the way that we try and package information. Radio is one. Obviously, using general media like newspapers, we shouldn't avoid. We tend always, and we do this as well, is to provide handbooks and to develop things into pamphlets, which are often then much more targeted to individual farmers. And they're very useful as well. But I think it's thinking about this whole sort of communication ecosystem of how do we link then our written materials together with other things like comics, adverts, and promotions in newspapers, and then the same using radio. And certainly in Kenya, there's also this program which uses television in rural areas, Shamba Shape Up, which is really a television program. It's worth looking up on the internet if you can find it, Shamba Shape Up, where they basically look about, it's like a reality TV program where farmers, where a couple of well-known public figures, basically TV stars, they go on to people's farms and they actually work together with them to actually improve the performance of the farms. And again, you think, well, not many people have televisions, but then when you look at the impact of some of those TV programs, there'll often be 40 or 50 people in a village sitting around watching this program, and it's actually got reach in the order of millions of viewers. Another question, what's my opinion about greenhouses? Are they good or bad? Maybe it's good for the environment and yield, but not for the landscape and working conditions. Well, yeah, greenhouses are really only used for the production of very high value crops, and that's to do with the large investment that has to be made, obviously, in setting them up, that they're only economic if they're actually producing crops which have got a high economic value. Now, greenhouses is a very good one for the Netherlands, of course, which is one of the countries with the largest area of greenhouses and very intensive production of vegetables, particularly in greenhouses. In the past, greenhouses were certainly very expensive on energy, but because of the cost of energy, there's been a lot of work done to actually make greenhouses more efficient. And from my own university here in Wageningen, actually greenhouses have been produced which actually, rather than using energy, they can actually generate energy through some very clever design. Greenhouses in general, though, have gone over to try very much to be efficient in terms of energy use. And so energy, in a sense, that's been covered to a large extent, I think. Because greenhouse agriculture is often very intensive, we then tend to think that we're using large amounts of agrochemicals at the same time. But because in greenhouses you are producing vegetables which are directly for human consumption, they've gone largely over to eliminating the use of pesticides, to be honest. So here in the Netherlands, definitely, nearly all greenhouse agriculture is done using biological control of pests and diseases, and virtually no agrochemical use in terms of disease and pest control. So greenhouses are a great way of focusing, if you like, production into a small area, of producing in the off-season when there's no opportunity for production in open fields. And in January this year, I was visiting a number of horticultural projects in northern Tanzania, where using screen houses and plastic houses, farmers are really investing a lot in greenhouse horticulture, both for the city market, for provision of vegetables, and also for export. And it's often then, on a small area of land, a way really of making a very good economic enterprise for production. Another question. So Prof. Doberman, Akim Doberman, was talking very much about the need to increase yields and to close the yield gaps. So how is this actually done? Wow. Now there's an open question, which I guess we have to we want to answer differently for more or less every different situation. When we talk about yield gaps, I think first of all we've got to, okay, there's a big initiative at the moment, which you can find on the internet, which is called the Global Yield Gap Atlas, where basically teams of researchers from a whole range of different countries have been trying to bring to the fore what are the gaps between current production in terms of yields and the yield that could be achieved given the boundaries of the agroecological conditions. Now we find very often that in more intensive agricultural systems, in Northern Europe, in the United States, or in North America, we're actually operating already close to something like 80% of potential production. And it's unlikely in these areas that we can really do much more in terms of yield gap closing. In many other parts of the world, and particularly again in developing countries, we often find that production is currently running at sometimes at only 10 or 20% of what is possible under given environments. And there, I think there are two things I'd like to say. First is that sometimes we think, oh, there's the biggest yield gap, so that's where we've got to focus on closing the yield gap. And I wonder if that's really always the best approach. Sometimes where there are very large yield gaps, those yield gaps are large for good reasons. It can be because the areas are very remote and it's hard for farmers in those areas to actually engage with markets. And it's unlikely then that we can just simply say in those areas, right now we've got to invest in technology to close the yield gap, because the other constraints, the institutions in relation to input and output markets, are probably not favorable to actually economically be able to close those yield gaps. And I think we've got to bear those other constraints in mind rather than just simply thinking yields here, we need to raise it up to that level. That's one point. The second point is that very often the gaps in yields that are there now are there because of the lack of technology. So either the lack of good, well-adapted genotypes, so that the plant breeding has not managed to achieve the necessary gains in terms of pest and disease control, so through genetic resistance. But very often the yield gaps are there because of the lack of nutrients, and that comes back to the point where we started really, that it's the lack of nutrient resources which actually lead to us having a very large yield gap. So in order to close those yield gaps, we need to basically get more nutrients into the system. And again, then that's all about, well, not only about economics, but also about distribution and supply. It's an exciting time in countries where we work in Africa these days, because we see a lot of investment particularly from fertilizer companies and the like, actually investing in the value chain to try and make sure that products actually do get out to more remote areas where we can actually then provide the wherewithal for farmers to actually use fertilizers so that they can increase their production. Closing yield gaps is one thing. A yield gap is usually determined for existing genotypes, and of course what breeders are trying to do all the time is actually to push the yield boundary further and further upwards. So in some ways we've got breeders always trying to increase the yield gap by pushing that boundary forward, whereas at the same time we've got the agronomists and the farmers who are running on behind trying to actually close the yield gap. So good genotypes, good management, that's often involving better nutrient management, and then of course making sure that we avoid losses in terms of crop losses both in the field due to pests and diseases, but also then post-harvest. Another question, well, these are getting more difficult I think as the time goes on. So the next question is, what kind of policy is needed to stimulate sustainable agricultural intensification? Yeah, again, it's really hard to just give blanket answers to these questions. And I think that's really got to be one of the main messages coming through our course as a whole. We've got to be thinking here about tailoring agricultural systems, tailoring intensification to local conditions. In North America and Europe, I think far too much emphasis in the past around production has been on making systems economic in terms of the provision of cheap food. I think when it comes to stimulating sustainable agriculture intensification, we've got to think more innovatively around policy. What sort of policies would potentially stimulate diversification in crops production systems? Are there ways that we can reward farmers to actually take on board different aspects of the agricultural production system rather than, say, policies which simply go either to subsidize inputs or to give better prices for outputs? Are there ways of engaging in policy which can actually stimulate more biodiversity-friendly forms of agriculture, or forms of agriculture which would actually stimulate diversification? So a good example for me would be if we look at, again, at European systems. Actually, we've been losing legumes from the systems progressively over time, because one of the reasons we've been losing legumes is basically because of the very, very cheap import of soybean feed into Europe, which has meant that farmers have tended then to rely on the import of cheap feed instead of growing legumes within their own systems. Now, one policy, which obviously would have broader repercussions, would be simply to actually put some tariff barrier on the import of soybean feed for animals, which would actually switch the economics to make it more economical for production of legumes locally. This is actually something we've been looking at also in relation to the African condition. In northern Ghana, where farmers have been adopting the use of soybean very much as a cash crop in their systems, with the benefits of soil fertility as well as some local consumption, which is good for nutrition, but providing then diversification in the system, that soybean production was really going very, very well until this year, in fact, when there's been a flood of cheap imports of soybean cake for chicken feed, which has actually collapsed local prices. So again, a sort of tariff system in Ghana, which actually made the import of feed inputs more expensive, would actually give then more stability to farmers in terms of their output prices, and actually make then the diversification away from continuous maize production into maize soybean rotations. It would make it more economic. So those are a couple of examples, and of course, you'll know me, I'll always end up talking more about legumes and other things, because that's one of the things that, one of the approaches that really excites me all the time, that we can use the nitrogen fixation from legumes in a way that can actually benefit in directive products, but also in terms of soil fertility. But I think it is one that really needs some much more imaginative thinking about policy to actually stimulate production of legumes as a whole. So I think that's all the questions that have been posed for now. You're welcome to add more questions onto the discussion threads in the course if there are things that come up that we haven't covered here now. And I think the next time I'll be talking to you directly will be on a discussion on smallholder farming with Will Masters, which is coming up, I think, next week. So it's all for now. Nice talking to you, and hope you enjoy the course.